Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're going to take a deep dive today into the war in Syria. Now, you might think things have been pretty quiet there for the last few years, but that is definitely not the case anymore. At the end of November, something happened that really nobody expected, not even the experts.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there. It caught everyone off guard. For years, the Syrian civil war had been kind of a frozen conflict. Sure, there were some skirmishes every now and then and some flare-ups, but nothing on this scale.
Yeah, and the speed of it all. It seems like these rebel groups just kind of came out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and boom, suddenly they're in control of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city.
Yeah, Aleppo was a major turning point back in 2016
Yeah.
when Assad's forces took the city with Russian backing. It was really a devastating loss for the rebels. And basically it confined them to the Idlib province. Now they've broken out of Idlib. And they've even captured a strategically really vital city.
I was reading some accounts of fighters entering Aleppo chanting, Damascus, Hama, and Homs will be next. Is that just them trying to sound tough, or do you think they could actually take those cities?
It's hard to say for sure, but this offensive has definitely signaled a real shift in the balance of power. We have to remember that Aleppo was a symbol of Assad's resilience, and its fall could have a serious demoralizing effect on his forces and supporters.
So let's talk about these rebels. Who exactly are we talking about here? I know we've heard about all these different groups over the years.
Well, the group leading this offensive is called Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. Their history is pretty complicated. They were initially an affiliate of al-Qaeda, but officially they broke ties back in 2016.
So they're not connected to al-Qaeda anymore.
Right.
That seems like a pretty big deal.
It is. However, they are still considered a hardline Islamist group. But what's interesting is that now they're part of a broader coalition of rebel groups, and some of those groups are actually backed by Turkey.
Wait, so former al-Qaeda affiliates are now working with Turkish-backed groups? This is getting complicated. Why now? Why do you think they chose to launch this offensive at this particular time?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. It seems like a few things happened to create the perfect storm. First, you have to look at what's going on in Ukraine. Russia is Assad's main ally, and they are deeply involved in that war. Their resources are stretched pretty thin, and their ability to support Assad in the same way that they did in the past is definitely in question.
And hasn't Iran, another one of Assad's allies, having her own issues lately?
Exactly. Iran's facing internal challenges, and their influence around the region has taken a hit. Hezbollah, their proxy force in Lebanon, has been weakened after recent conflicts with Israel. So basically, both of Assad's main allies are preoccupied, and they might be less willing or able to give him that same level of support.
So it sounds like the rebels saw an opportunity and they took it. What about Assad, though? What's his response been to all of this?
Well, it's interesting you say that because it took Assad several days to even say anything at all, which analysts think is a sign that his regime is in disarray. When he finally did speak, he vowed to defend Syria's stability and territorial integrity. Syrian and Russian warplanes have started launching airstrikes against rebel-held areas, mainly in Aleppo and Idlib.
But if his allies are busy in other places, how effective can those airstrikes really be?
It's a big question mark. We don't know for sure how much Russia's willing to commit at this point. Iran's overstretched. And Hezbollah can't really help all that much right now. Assad might end up in a much weaker position than he was expecting.
I mean, this has got to be a big blow to him. His family has been ruling Syria for decades. This makes you wonder, could this be it? Is this the beginning of the end for Assad?
It's definitely possible. We need to consider all the other players in this very complex situation, though, like Turkey. They've been backing some of these rebel groups for years, and they have their own interests in the region, especially when it comes to the Kurds.
Ah, yes, the Kurds. I know they were a major force fighting against ISIS, but Turkey sees them as a threat. Why is that?
Well, it goes back a long way. There's a long history of Kurdish separatism in Turkey. And there's a sizable Kurdish population in northern Syria. Turkey's worried about an independent Kurdish state forming right on their border. That could destabilize the entire region, and it could even make separatist movements inside Turkey stronger.
So we've got rebels fighting Assad, rebels fighting Kurds, Turkey trying to keep everybody in line, and Assad trying to stay in power without much support from his allies.
Right, and we can't forget about the millions of Syrian civilians who are stuck in the middle of this. The humanitarian crisis is already horrible, and this recent offensive is just going to make things worse.
Yeah.
Thousands of people are fleeing Aleppo and Idlib, adding to the millions who've already been displaced by the war.
It's so heartbreaking to think about. I read reports of Russian airstrikes hitting hospitals in Aleppo. This just shows the human cost of this conflict and the awful things that are happening to innocent people.
Absolutely. And this situation just highlights the global refugee crisis and how difficult it is to get aid to people when there's active fighting going on.
We've covered a lot today. So let's recap before we move on. What we've learned so far is this surprise offensive by these rebels, led by HTS, has totally changed what's happening in the Syrian war.
For sure. It's shown that Assad's regime is vulnerable, and it's highlighted how the alliances and the whole power dynamic in the region is changing and reshaping this conflict.
Okay, so now we've got the basics. Let's dig deeper into some of the biggest questions that have come out of all this. First and foremost, is this really the beginning of the end for Assad?
Well, that's a really complicated question, and I don't think anyone can say for sure right now. But there are definitely signs that his hold on power is getting weaker. I mean, losing Aleppo is a big deal. It's a symbolic loss and a strategic loss. And his allies are distracted with other things. It's not clear how much they actually help him. He's definitely in a tough spot right now.
But even if Assad is weaker than he used to be, is there someone who can take his place? Can this group of rebels actually govern? I mean, they're a pretty mixed bag, and they don't necessarily all agree on what they want.
Right, that's another big question. Can HTS work with the more moderate groups given their Islamist background? And what about Turkey? Are they going to try to control these rebel groups? Or will they let them do their own thing?
You brought up Turkey earlier. Let's talk about what they're doing here. They've been involved in the Syrian conflict for a long time, but it's hard to figure out what they're really after.
Turkey's got a lot going on in Syria. It's a mix of security concerns and strategic goals. Their main focus has been trying to keep the Kurds under control, especially along their border. They don't want a Kurdish state to form there, because that could make Kurdish separatists inside Turkey even more active.
And then there's the whole refugee crisis. Millions of Syrians have fled to Turkey since the war started.
Yeah, exactly. Taking care of millions of refugees is a huge burden on Turkey, both financially and socially. They're trying to create a buffer zone inside Syria, a safe area where they could maybe resettle some of the refugees and keep more from coming into Turkey.
So Turkey's playing a delicate game here. They're supporting some rebel groups, but they're also trying to deal with the Kurds, and they've got this massive refugee problem on their hands. It's hard to see how that's all going to work out in the end.
It really is a balancing act. And it's even more complicated because some of the rebel groups Turkey supports are also fighting against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are led by the Kurds, and they've been the most effective group in the fight against ISIS.
It's a mess. You got rebels fighting Assad, rebels fighting Kurds, Turkey trying to manage everybody, and Assad hanging on with almost no help from his allies.
And we have to remember the Syrian people. They're stuck in the middle of all this. The humanitarian situation is terrible, and this new fighting is going to make things even worse.
We've been focusing on Aleppo. But the situation in Idlib province is really bad too. That's where most of the people who've been displaced inside Syria are, and they're basically trapped.
It's a disaster waiting to happen. Idlib's overcrowded, and they don't have enough resources. If the fighting gets worse there, we could see a lot of people killed and even more refugees fleeing.
What do you think the future holds for Syria? There are so many different things happening, so many possibilities. What are some of the outcomes we might see in the coming months or years?
It's tough to say for sure because things are changing so fast, but here are a few scenarios. One possibility is that everyone agrees to a ceasefire. And we go back to what we had before this recent fighting, a kind of frozen conflict.
So basically a stalemate. Everyone keeps the territory they have now, and nobody tries to take anything else.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But it would require Russia, Turkey, and Iran to come to some sort of agreement. They're the main outside forces involved in this conflict. It wouldn't really solve the problems that started the war, but it could at least stop the violence for a while.
But would it really last? I mean, there's so much distrust between these countries, and they all want different things.
That's true. It's a fragile kind of peace. Another possibility is that Assad manages to fight back with help from Russia and Iran, and he takes back some or maybe even all of the territory he's lost.
But wouldn't that require a lot of support from Russia and Iran? And they're both dealing with other problems right now.
It would. And it would probably be a very violent campaign. A lot of civilians would get caught in the crossfire.
That sounds like it could easily escalate into a bigger regional conflict.
It's a real risk. And then there's the most extreme scenario, the one that seemed impossible a few weeks ago. Assad's regime collapses completely.
Wow. A total collapse. What would that even look like?
It's hard to say exactly, but it would probably mean a power vacuum. All these different groups would be fighting to take control. The country could descend into even more chaos and violence. It might even break up into smaller states.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah.
Not just for Syria, but for the whole region.
It would have a huge impact. You could see a flood of refugees, more instability in neighboring countries, and groups like ISIS could make a comeback.
So we've got a few different possibilities. A ceasefire, Assad fighting back, or a total collapse. It's a lot to think about.
It is, and it just shows how complicated this conflict is, and how hard it's going to be to find a solution that works for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the different groups involved, the possible outcomes, and the humanitarian disaster. But what does this all mean in the bigger picture? What are the global implications of what's happening in Syria?
This conflict could change the entire geopolitical landscape, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. It's basically a mini version of the bigger struggle for power between countries like Russia, the United States, Iran, and Turkey.
And they're all fighting their own little battles in Syria, even though they often disagree with each other.
Exactly. And what's happening in Syria is already having an effect on other countries. The refugee crisis is putting a strain on neighboring countries in Europe. Groups like ISIS are a threat to everyone, and the conflict has become a proxy war, with Russia and the West supporting different sides.
It shows how what happens in one part of the world can affect everyone else.
Definitely. And it shows why we need a better coordinated international response to this crisis.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. You've explained a really complex situation in a way that's easy to understand. I'm sure our listeners are learning a lot.
I'm glad to hear that. It's so important to stay informed, to think critically, and to try to understand all the different points of view.
So before we move on, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they process all of this information?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this conflict isn't over. Things are still changing all the time. It's impossible to predict what's going to happen, and there are no easy solutions.
And we can't forget about the people in Syria. They're the ones suffering the most. The humanitarian crisis is terrible. We need to find ways to help them.
Definitely. Their stories matter. We can't ignore what they're going through. And we need to remember that what happens in Syria affects everyone.
It has global implications.
This conflict represents some of the biggest challenges we're facing in the world today. War, displacement, political instability, and the fight for power. It shows that we're all connected. What happens in one place can have an impact on people all over the planet.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming sometimes, just thinking about how connected everything is. But it also shows that we're not completely helpless. We can stay informed, we can support organizations that are trying to help, and we can speak out for peaceful solutions.
That's a really good point. Awareness is the first step. It's easy to feel disconnected from what's happening on the other side of the world, but we have to try to understand what's going on and how it's affecting people's lives.
And like we've seen with this latest offensive in Syria, things can change so quickly. It was a frozen conflict, and then all of a sudden, it's a major crisis.
Exactly. It shows why it's so important to pay attention and stay informed. Decisions that world leaders make, things that armed groups do, even things that seem completely unrelated that are happening in other parts of the world, can all have a direct impact on millions of people in Syria.
This deep dive has really made that clear. It's been fascinating, but also kind of scary, exploring all these different connections.
Yeah. It's a reminder that peace and stability are something we have to constantly work for. There are always forces out there that want to create chaos and division.
It can feel pretty hopeless sometimes. But then you see how strong the Syrian people are. They're still trying to survive and rebuild, even after everything they've been through.
It's incredible. It should inspire all of us to do whatever we can to help them.
Well said. This has been a really intense deep dive, but I think it was really important. I feel like I understand the conflict in Syria so much better now and the things that are influencing how it's going to unfold.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope our listeners feel the same way.
And remember, this is just the beginning. We encourage everyone to keep learning about this, to look for different perspectives, and have conversations about these really important global issues.
The more we know, the better. We need informed citizens to help create a more peaceful and just world.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We always appreciate your feedback.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.